Our guest this week is Maher Dabbah, author of A Promising Middle East, a Palestinian who still believes in a Middle East peace process. Welcome back to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. Our guest this week is Maher Dabbah. Maher is a professor, he's a lawyer, he works here at Queen Mary University. He comes from a village near Haifa in today's Israel. He's a wonderful man in so much as he still believes in a Middle East peace process. We're going to talk today with Maher about the Abdullah Plan, or as I know it, but as our listeners know it, the Arab Initiative, and whether that has any credibility in today's world. We're going to talk about whether we envision a one-state, a two-state, or a three-state solution for Palestine. And we're going to talk about the role of the international community. Maher, welcome to the English Hour on ANN. We're going to go to a short video for our listeners, and then we'll start our discussion. In Beirut in 2002, Saudi Arabia's then Crown Prince, later King Abdullah, proposed an initiative aimed at installing peace between Israel and the Arab nations, conditional on the return of the occupied territories and fair resolution of the refugee crisis, amongst other things. More than a decade after the Beirut summit, not a single one of the 22 Arab signatory states have withdrawn their support for the Arab plan. This leads some of us to believe that there might be a chance for bringing the conflicting partners back to the negotiation table with a new, phased introduction of the Arab plan. International efforts have concentrated on a two-state solution in recent times, and little progress has been made. The issue of Jerusalem and the settlements and the West Bank make it a complicated way forward, and the one-state solution may, some are starting to think, prove simpler. The support that Israel receives from the United States makes the role of international powers a sensitive one. The USA's attempts at brokering a peace deal can too often be seen by Arab states as being favorable to Israel. What credible role can the US and indeed the rest of the international community play in proceedings towards peace in future? So Maher, thank you so much again for being with us. We've got an interesting subject for discussion, but one we're all very familiar with, perhaps depressingly familiar with. You're Palestinian, you're Israeli-Palestinian actually, but you come from a village it's close to Haifa, and your family is there. You're here lecturing in the UK, and you've written extensively on many issues with regard to law, but you've written one quite seminal and interesting book, which we'll more about later on the actual Middle East peace process. What do you see? I mean, I've always been a believer in a comprehensive peace for Palestine, and I felt that was what's needed because the Palestinians will be stronger in that context. And as a framework for that, the Abdullah Plan, as I think of it, I mean, Crown Prince Abdullah became King Abdullah, and bless his heart, dear man is dead now, and still the plan that he conceived when he was a Crown Prince has never been implemented, never even been well received in Israel. But there, to my way of thinking, there is nothing else. I mean, what is your feeling about that?
Well, the Abdullah Plan, or the Saudi Plan, as is probably more widely known to people, and including here, probably in this context, you could mention the revival of that plan in the form of the Qatari plan more recently is one, as you quite rightly said, William, does aim at bringing some sort of comprehensive peace to the Middle East. Is that a practical step? Is this something that is probably, or you can say, is that something that matches the reality of the Middle East as it has evolved, especially in recent times? I feel that the answer is no. I feel that probably the push or the talk about comprehensive peace plan has somehow undermined the desire, or let us say even the possibility, or added to that the probability of peace. And that's simply because of the complexities of the region as they stand. And you can really test this in a number of ways. One way that I would like to test it always is by looking at the Israeli perspective here. The perspective of the Israeli government is that if you think about it normally, you would expect that with the announcement of such plan, or with such an unprecedented offer by Crown Prince Abdullah at the time, you normally would think that any Israeli government would simply jump at the opportunity. Yet this didn't happen. This wasn't really the case, and you can even add something different, which is when there was the revival of that plan more recently in the form of the Qatari plan, there was even a dismissal of the plan by many senior Israeli politicians. And I've always found that the reason for this is that simply, as far as Israel is concerned, when it looks at the situation, it says, hang on, this is offering us some kind of a package of diplomatic ties and relations with all Arab countries, possibly also all Muslim countries around the world.
Indeed.
But somehow Israel feels that it already has relations with those states that it's interested in having relations with, whether they're formally, openly, or informally under the surface, if you like. And so I am not sure to what extent one could attribute, let us say, considerable weight to the plan itself, and the fact that it hasn't really taken off at all, you can say, hasn't been taken with any particular seriousness, especially from the Israeli side, tells you pretty much as you would like to know.
But it is a great opportunity. Israel is a small country of 500,000 Jewish citizens. I know it has a couple of million Palestinians within Israel, but and in the wider context, if you take Israel and the territories, then of course you're talking about considerably more Palestinians, and the situation is with the if you look at Israel in relation to the Arab and Muslim world, it's a little island, and okay, one generation, but how many generations can you wait for peace? Ultimately, Israel is very dependent on its Western allies, and without them, it's hugely vulnerable. And if you're going to have a long-term peace, what an offer. Israel wants recognition of Jerusalem as its capital. It wants it could be the trading hub of the Arab world. It could be, it could be a vibrant and far more. It's prosperous now, but it could be really a vibrant force on the international stage if it took a plan which would cost it nothing. It would put an end to all this endless war and trouble that it has with Gaza, or with the new intifadas or whatever might be coming their way. Isn't the Abdullah plan an opportunity for Israel?
I would say, William, that I in many ways agree with you. I think the case for peace is already there. The case for the Saudi plan, the Abdullah plan, or the Qatari plan, or any other similar initiative is certainly there. These are plans that speak for themselves. But what I'm talking about here, and what I feel one should pay particular attention to, is not, let us say, that kind of objective perspective that you've presented, but rather to the politics of the situation, the politics of the region, the politics that are prevalent within Israel, which is, from a political point of view, let us say from a nationalistic point of view, or national, more widely, point of view as far as Israel is concerned. When you really look at the attitude of the Israeli leadership, they simply, from their point of view, they have nothing or no particular reason to rush for and embrace such a plan, because certainly they feel that they are strong enough to be able to survive, and frankly I'm not sure to what extent, not that I defend or believe that this attitude is justified, but I'm not sure to what extent the Israeli leadership or part of it believes at least that there is a need to engage with the Arab world significantly, whether in terms of trade ties or any other ties. Rather, they feel that their outlook is Western and Westernized, and they should look towards the West. And I feel that even part of that leadership feels that the best approach is a policy of isolation, a policy of detachment from the Arab world, as opposed to one that would seek to have them engaged with the Arab world. As I said, I would not find this justified in my eyes, but what I would say is that when you look at the reality, it's important to look at it from the perspective of the relevant parties as opposed to objectively, because objectively, if you look at it, peace in the Middle East should have been established a long time ago. There is no reason why not.
But before we move on, just to say, I'm a great believer in the phased introduction of the Abdullah Plan. The idea that we could have not instant recognition and instant by all states, and instantly all the concessions that the Arabs want, the Golan back and so on. But if you could take steps and then have concessions step by step by the Arab world to match concessions by Israel, because what have we got? Is Israel so comfortable or strong? In 2006, it was a terrible, destructive war with Lebanon, in which the entire population of northern Israel were driven south, or virtually the entire population of northern was driven south in fear. We've just had this atrocious, but not comparatively recently, this atrocious new war with Gaza, which nobody was a winner, and you've had minor but significant intifada type occurrences on the West Bank recently, and in Jerusalem particularly, right in the very heart of Palestine-Israel, so to speak. It's not a great situation. Israel's doing well economically, but that's on the back of the West and of its relationship with America and others. But it's not a sustainable situation for generation on generation. And if you're going to have walls in an era of rockets and an era of the radicalization of the Middle East, ISIS and other elements, ISIS today, God knows what tomorrow. Surely it's time for Israel to wake up, is it?
I totally agree with you. I would add two things to what you have said, William. The first is that it's not only time to wake up, it's past time to wake up. And the second thing is I very much subscribe to what you've talked about in terms of the shift or the development since 2006. I've always used the following example, that in 2006, when the Second Lebanon War was waged, there were various citizens of the State of Israel in the Tel Aviv area, including possibly even around the Haifa area, that offered shelter to those residents in the north, thinking that this was basically happening in another country. Only pretty much 3 years later, with the first campaign and war in Gaza, and in the second, then you found citizens in Tel Aviv themselves, residents of Tel Aviv, running for cover. The reality speaks for itself. Is this policy of isolation a sensible one? Absolutely not. But that is the point that I think all of us should be aware of, is that the Middle East reality, or the current Middle East reality, is one in which common sense is not prevailing. Good judgment is not prevailing. What's prevailing in it is simply bad politics. It's simply short-sighted politics. You can even add, I'm afraid, it's also incompetence in and among the leadership. And so to go back to the point that I was making, is absolutely no justification for this at all. And again, it's something that I've always believed in. It doesn't matter how strong you are in military terms or economic terms. It's impossible and virtually impossible if you want to thrive as a nation in this world. You've got to integrate. You've got to basically participate in the international family as a good member of that family. You can't live in isolation. No state, doesn't matter how strong you are, can flourish and basically enhance your standing and the welfare of your citizens in isolation. And I feel that that is something to be said about Israel in this regard, is that you're talking about leadership in that case. I always try to make the distinction between leadership and the country itself, because leadership changes the country, of course that includes the citizens, etc. So the emphasis here is more on leadership. And if you look at the current leadership in Israel, and frankly the leadership that has been around for quite some time now, is one that is simply confronting reality. It is one that's simply somehow clashing with facts. And there is something that I believe all of us should always remember. When you clash with facts, you can never prevail. Doesn't matter how strong you are, you can never prevail. And I think that's the serious mistake, and that's probably, you can even say, the tragedy from which Israel, and by the way, in so many parallels, the Palestinians have been suffering from.
Well, let's talk. I mean, we talked about, of course, the Abdullah Plan, or the Arab Initiative, whatever you call it, is still Beirut Initiative. Some people call it. Still close to my heart. But let's move on a moment to another theme we were going to discuss. The issue of, it is interesting, the issue of a one-state, two-state, or three-state solution. I mean, we have de facto at the moment, we have three states in Israel-Palestine. We have the Israel proper, we have the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, such as it is, this state focused on Ramallah, and I know that there's a long way to go, because much of the West Bank is under settlement and so on by Israel. But nonetheless, we have some sort of rump state there, and we have a rump state in Gaza, ruled entirely separately, whatever one pretends, by a Hamas government. And I've been to Gaza many times, and I know that there are kind of peace talks, but essentially these three entities are going to remain separate, aren't they? There's not true prospect of a process that will bring a federation of and bring the two Palestinian elements together in one. It's not going to happen. A two-state solution, as the traditional two-state solution concept, is surely impossible now.
It's interesting, William, that you've mentioned this sequence of 1, 2, 3. Well, obviously that's not how the sequence itself developed, because we never started with 1 here, then moved to 2, and then moved to 3. We started with 2, then to 1, then to 3.
Yes.
And I feel that probably we haven't as yet witnessed the final scene in Middle East history. It's very likely that people can easily add number 4 and number 5, so on and so forth. I would tell you about something that I've come to believe in firmly, and I've learned this from outside the Middle East context. I've learned this particularly from my own, or let's say my major area of specialization, which is computational and policy. There is no magic in numbers. And so when it comes to numbers, for me, numbers are just tools. I'm not a great believer in numbers as such. They do not represent, for me, absolute things. They represent relative things. And there is a reason why I say this, because I don't think here it's about the 1, 2, or 3 as such. And incidentally, if you look at how things have been developing, they are very interesting. For example, traditionally, it used to be thought that those who believed in the two-state solution, where people who felt, that there should be some kind of just settlement, so on and so forth. And at some point things had changed, that, those who came to believe in the one-state solution are really the ones who want peace. That means they want the Arabs and Jews to live together. So if you look at the core of the peace camp, especially within Israel and Palestine nowadays, probably you will come across many people who are the greatest believers in peace, and they would talk about the one-state solution. Yet, interestingly, in parallel to that, if you look at the extreme right wing of Israeli politics, you find people there talking about exactly that, the one-state solution. You can look at, for example, the policy by the Jewish Home, Habayit HaYehudi, and its leader, Naftali Bennett, talking about essentially one-state solution. So therefore, that's another reason why, for me, numbers should not be the relevant thing here, because here it is. We have reached a situation where those who are very much want integration and equality, etc., among Palestinians and Israelis believe in the one-state solution, and those who simply believe that the Palestinians are their enemies want the one-state solution. And that therefore brings me to what I feel believe the emphasis should be on. And that is not on the numbers, but on one thing, which is the following, that ultimately the numbers here should be about peace. They are the tools to bring us that peace, that desired peace. And so to have that kind of peace, I think we need to bear in mind the following. First of all, that no peace can be achieved here until the Arabs and the Jews are able to be living in establishments, let's call it establishments or entities. It doesn't matter what kind of form that entity will take. Entities where they are able to prosper, where they are able to govern their affairs, where they are able to look after the welfare of their citizens properly, but also very importantly, and that's the second element, where the two sides are able to interact and to cooperate, because no sustainable peace will be really possible in this case if we just talked about the two-state solution, two states living side by side but no relations whatsoever.
Yes.
Added to that, I would say it's always good to look at the facts on the ground. And in the example that you gave, you're quite right. If you look at the facts on the ground, the facts themselves tell you everything that you need to know. Meaning that, possibly that we should revisit the calculation or the use of numbers in this case, because look at, how the detachment of the Gaza Strip from the West Bank, and look at, the position in which Israel is found in this case. So therefore, I think, before we talk about numbers in this case, it's important to look at what are the key requirements that should be fulfilled from the perspective of the Arabs, the perspective of the Jews, Palestinians, Israelis in this case, and what would be necessary for them to basically live and lead a life and prosper as normal peoples would normally do.
Well, if we're talking about Palestinians and Israelis living side by side in harmony or in concord, so true peace, as opposed to kind of what we have now, which is kind of a hudna situation, a kind of pause in fighting, which goes on, I mean, particularly with regard to Gaza, but applies up to a point to the West Bank as well. There's not true peace, not true concord or harmony. So in that situation, obviously, I mean, talking personally, I would envision, it's not for me because I'm not Palestinian, but I would envision a two-state solution, the traditional view, as the way forward. And I would certainly think that there are certain obvious things that are so obvious and so simple, like the idea that Palestine can have a capital in Jerusalem, and so too can Israel. In my view, that's not a problem. You can have shared sovereignty, or you can have one city, two nations, one capital. I don't see any problem with that at all. And the mere technicalities of who administers security, or who does the water supply, or who does this, who does that, who does the planning permission for building houses, or whatever it might be, these are minor issues. compared to the symbolic resonance of Jerusalem being the capital of Palestine. I mean, so these things are not, I don't think these things are difficult. And I don't see any problem with Palestinian refugees coming back to Palestinian land. Certainly in the West Bank and Gaza, I can appreciate the Israeli fear of the growth in Israeli Arab population, which makes it very difficult to them to have Palestinian refugees coming back to mainstream Israel. But there are so many of the issues that are at the heart of the Middle East peace process are just so easily resolvable. And we've seen the Clinton parameters, the good work Clinton did on the peace process. God knows that was an achievement. Heaven help us if his wife gets elected president of the United States, because she is cut from very different cloth from Mr. Clinton, and is totally, well, maybe, but there you are, you see. I mean, obviously, extremists do make peace sometimes, so maybe it's not bad to have an extreme U.S. president with extreme views. But what is your vision? I know you say you don't care about numbers, but do you have a vision for the kind of future you would like to see in terms of Palestine and Israel?
That's, if I may say so, a big loaded statement, William, and question. Let's start with things at a very basic level. At a very basic level, we have this. There are no doubt situations in this world which are problematic because they are problematic. But I believe that there are many problems that we perceive as problems. They are problems, and they are only problems because we make them so. So coming to the Israelis and the Palestinians in this particular case, it's very important to, before answering the question whether it should be the two-state or the one-state, it's very important to realize that on the ground, first, there is lack of national consensus, sufficient national consensus on both the Israelis, on the part of the Israelis and on the part of the Palestinians. So, assuming for a moment that we are going to go for the two-state solution in this case, look at the Palestinian side, divided leadership. It's not only about Gaza being detached from the West Bank. Look at what's happening in terms of the political leadership. There is no consensus. There is no national consensus, even on the most basic things when it comes to Palestinian aspirations. They simply, if you look at Fatah, if you look at the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority as it exists nowadays, if you look at Hamas, their perception and their perspectives differ. If you move to the other side, to the Israeli side, again you realize, just simply by glancing fairly quickly at the composition within the Knesset, the parliament, and even at the wider public spectrum, you will find there too there is lack of consensus. So I think it's the point that you've made about, it's all solvable. I certainly agree with that. But again, that is from an objective point of view. Yet here we have a situation where it is lacking that kind of objectivity. It is lacking that kind of objective perspective, because you're talking about two sides that are not driving themselves objectively. They are not driving themselves reasonably for the purposes of seeking and for the purposes of ultimately achieving true peace. Is it possible for a city like Jerusalem to be shared? 1001%, yes. Is peace an impossible thing? Peace is never impossible. If you look at, putting the Middle East to one side for the moment, if you look at the wider world, look at what we had in history, and look at how nations came together ultimately, and how they formed peace. If you look at the Middle East itself, the Egyptians and the Israelis fought each other very bitterly, since day one, pretty much in 1948 when Israel was established, and they were able to achieve peace ultimately. So peace is not an impossible thing. The question is whether, in this particular case, we are talking about sides that have learned to live in peace, that they have learned to appreciate peace, that, to go back to an earlier point, very interesting point that you have raised, sides that they realize the importance of peace for them, for their own selfish interest. And when you look at the situation as it stands, this is simply lacking. We do not have two sides who have learned and are learning how to live in peace. We do not have two sides that actually appreciate or believe in the value of peace for them, whether economically or politically or socially, or call it, in whichever other context you would like. And so, back therefore to the core of the question that you've asked, am I personally a two-state solution person or a one-state solution person? I tend to look at things pragmatically. There is no doubt that what I would like to see is a two-state solution. Why two-state solution? Two-state solution because I believe this would be a very good way to give both parties the ability to govern themselves properly, independently, autonomously in this particular case. But at the same time, I believe that a two-state solution without the criterion that I mentioned earlier, the requirement that I mentioned earlier, which is the requirement of cooperation and integration between these two states, the two-state solution in this particular case will be only disastrous in the longer term. And why do I say disastrous? Simply for the following reason. Because should there be an action launched by a group within one of the two states, in this case an act of aggression, for example, then that can easily lead to a war between the two states here, as far as international law is concerned, and that is not going to make things a lot easier. At the same time, because I tend to look at things here pragmatically and practically, do I rule out the possibility of a one-state solution being simply the ultimate and only choice? I do not rule it out. And if you were to ask me sincerely here, I feel the facts on the ground, as they have been evolving, developing, they have been pushing the two sides towards that goal.
Yes, I can see that. Let's talk about, the third element of our discussion, the role of the international powers. We have seen, a little while ago now, but not that long ago, we saw quite a lot of trouble on the West Bank. There were some disturbing incidents, some killings and so forth. Indeed, killings of Israelis. There was a response to this because it was getting out of hand. And the King Abdullah II of Jordan called a tripartite meeting between the US Secretary of State, Netanyahu, and himself. Palestine would have been represented, but Abu Mazen decided to decline. He declined because Netanyahu was there. I think, in my view, as an outsider, a mistake, but anyway, he did that. But nonetheless, King Abdullah II acted kind of as an honorary Palestinian and negotiated for the Arab side. And there were concessions made by Israel, particularly the signal concession of allowing young men to go to Haram al-Sharif. Never happened before, and it came up, and it was peaceful. But, and it was an important step because Israel had been keeping young Palestinian men from going to worship on a Friday for many, many years. It's not a new phenomenon. So you had, but if that were the only achievement, that would be fine. But the other thing, they seemed to be bought into by Netanyahu having his arm twisted by America and the rest, and by the situation, which he wanted calm, no doubt, for his own re-election, or what he hoped to see as his own re-election. The other thing was an Israeli green light in the aftermath of the Israeli elections to a new U.S. attempt, a last U.S. attempt to broker peace at the hand of Mr. Kerry. Encouraging, perhaps. Whatever else you say about Kerry, he has labored hard in his way to try and deal with an intractable situation. He has worked. What do you feel? I mean, do you feel the international community is doing all it should in terms of Israel and Palestine and promoting peace, or is it sitting back too much?
Well, the international community, I think there are two things that ought to be said about the international community. First, that the role of the international community with regard to the Israeli relations with the Palestinians ought to be looked at, especially nowadays within the wider context, which is the role of the international community as far as the entire Middle East is concerned. And in that respect, I think there is only one conclusion that should be reached, and that is the role by the international community hasn't been constructive. In many ways, it has been even highly damaging to the region. It has been even a case of catastrophic failure. And one can give, in this particular case, two brief examples without necessarily going into them in great details. If you look at the position or the situation as far as the awful group ISIS, this group has come to form to flourish where? Iraq and Syria. Iraq, a country that was torn apart in 2003 by a war imposed on it by foreign powers or by the part of the international community.
Yes, yes.
And Syria, that has been in a very bloody civil war of its own, but in relation to which the international community has been dragging its feet in a shocking manner. So therefore,
you would expect more intervention from the international community, or do you think it was been?
I think there is a big responsibility for the international community when it comes to situations like the Middle East. You can't fail or hesitate or be late to act. At the same time, you need to realize that there are mistakes and there are omissions, and both of them can be costly. Many times, it's not only the price of mistake that we have to bear and that we suffer from. Sometimes it's the price and the cost of omission. So in this case, you have two very interesting things. You have a mistake in relation to Iraq and an omission, because there was an action, obviously, in that case, and an omission in relation to Syria. And both of these things, by the international community, the mistake plus the omission, have not brought the Middle East the stability that we all desire and the peace.
We'd done more in Syria, you would have been accusing us of a mistake in Syria. And I mean, actually, to be fair, the international community, to be fair, the Arab world everywhere is touched, has been pretty catastrophic. Even Libya now, where for us, the Arab Spring, I know the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, but for many of us in the international world, thought of the Arab Spring as beginning in Libya. And Libya, where we intervened on a massive scale, even though we didn't put troops on the ground like in Iraq. We had trainers on the ground, because I met our own special forces, who certainly were in Libya and covertly. And I was in Libya at the time of the war, the time of the first civil war. Here we are in the second Libyan civil war. I mean, our failures are legion in the Middle East, and maybe we shouldn't touch and intervene so much.
Well, it would be wonderful if that was the case, and if that was the policy or the philosophy of the international community, but it's not. Because what you've had in relation to the Middle East over a very long period of time is intervention. You've had a policy where basically the international community pretty much focused not on the peoples of the Middle East, it focused on the leadership. Most of this leadership was broken regimes, brutal regimes, sustained, given the blessing and the seal of the international community, when that shouldn't have been the case. So therefore, really, pretty much that's the second point that I wanted to make with reference to the question that you've asked, which is what can the international community do, and has the international community done enough in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian situation? My answer is that if you put it in a wider context, you will find the following, that when the international community should have acted, it did not act. When it shouldn't have acted, it did act. And when it acted, there wasn't really consistency in its actions.
In regard to Israel and Palestine?
With regard to Israel, Palestine, and the wider Middle East. Because remember, I think it's impossible to detach the Israeli-Palestinian situation from the wider situation. Why is that? There is no doubt that what happens in Egypt is very relevant as far as the Israeli-Palestinian situation is concerned. Gazans, the citizens in Gaza, who, as you know, suffer so much. They are pretty much isolated between what? Located between the Big C, Israel, and Egypt.
Yes.
So what happens in Egypt, any change in the government in Egypt, has direct impact on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. So when you say the international community, I don't think you can narrow it down to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. It's important to put it in that wider context. And when you put it in that wider context, and you mentioned the efforts by Secretary Kerry, it's always wonderful when you have such efforts. I'm the first person that would love to see more and more good efforts bringing about peace, but it's not about making big efforts at some point and then basically resting on your laurels for quite some time. And so that's the consistency that I talked about. These efforts haven't been consistent.
So you want the kind of consistency that Bill Clinton delivered to
I think not only with regard to Bill Clinton. I think the consistency that you need is probably, I would say, back to the Carter administration. Maybe on the whole it wasn't a very successful administration.
Was Carter involved as Bill Clinton?
I believe the difference between them is this, is that Carter, arguably, in my eyes, President Carter was a little bit more pragmatic than President Clinton, and also maybe had the facts or the events in the region in his favor and on his side, in the sense that the people who came into power in both Israel and Egypt at that time were committed to peace.
Yes, of course.
And that's not the situation that President Clinton faced 100%, although arguably the two situations are fairly similar, because who did you have at that time after Netanyahu was pushed out of office? You had Ehud Barak replacing him, who came on the peace ticket for Israel, and on the other side, Arafat, who was embraced by the United States and other powers in the world as somebody who was committed to peace.
Early days, we had much more international involvement. We had the Madrid conference.
Yes.
We had multiple tracks, because we even had an Egypt-Israel disarmament track.
That's right,
and we certainly had. The World Economic Forum Middle East summits were the last thing to go, but we had a very strong economic track. And real engagement from the international community. It is true to say that we haven't seen that level of engagement. We keep leaving it to America. We just leave it to America, and they'll do it or they won't do it. Would you like that bigger framework like we had at Madrid, in the post-Madrid world, where there were real players? I mean, Canada was supposed to be responsible for refugees. There was a real environment of international involvement in this. Whether Israel would accept it again is another question, but would you like to see that level of international engagement?
I am certainly in favor of a wider international engagement. At the same time, I do believe in the importance of U.S. leadership in this world. But I've always said the following, which is the United States can always be a leader among equals. The situation that you've had in the Middle East is this. It hasn't been in relation to U.S. dominance and lack of international involvement. It has been different. The situation has been as follows, that the Middle East has been used within, you can argue, a wider, not necessarily struggle,
yes.
but some kind of balance of powers
Yes,
in the wider
yes,
in the
yes.
wider world. And you see this in recent years as far as the US and Russia is concerned. And look at the statements that are coming from the actions of these two different countries. Is that if you look at what happened in Egypt especially, you find that the statement and the conclusion is this, is that the United States is very quick to abandon its allies, and therefore that is nothing
Yes.
but simply a country that uses leadership in the region for its own interest, as opposed to for the interest of the people. And look at the statement from the Russian side, on the other hand, how Vladimir Putin is supporting Bashar al-Assad very consistently. And in that regard, he is sending a very important and significant message to the rest of the Middle East, which is that we never abandon our allies. So the Middle East has been caught in that particular trap. I feel that a bigger role for the international community will be no doubt a positive thing within that role, or within that camp of powers. The United States, from my point of view, can be a leader, but at the same time it's also important to remember that the change, if it is to be meaningful change within the region, it must come within the countries themselves. So the international community, I think there is a problem there. It is part of the problem, sadly so, or has been on various occasions within the Middle East. It has made the situation far worse in many respects, and we mentioned the example of Iraq, Syria, etc., and even the Israelis and the Palestinians. But at the same time, it certainly can be part of the solution. The question is, can you achieve consistency? Can you be consistent? And if you look at the United States and other powers, Canada, for example, that you've mentioned, saying at some point would be responsible for refugees and so on and so forth, and having the humanitarian, the honesty broker kind of reputation and stance, Canada has changed totally dramatically. Canadian politics, or the Canadian leadership in recent years, has been siding 100% with Israel, if you see what I mean, and that's not helpful. So when it comes to the international community, I think it can be part of the solution, but what you really need in this particular case is a community that acts responsibly. And I would really here add the following. I don't know whether I'm the only person here, but I do believe that there are other people who feel the same. I personally don't feel that a great confidence when I look at leadership around the world when it comes to the Middle East.
No.
Great confidence, the kind of confidence that normally you should feel when you look at a leadership, or a particular leader, or more than one leader, which is the feeling that I can rely on such leadership.
Well, we do
I
lack.
can trust such leadership. I can feel inspired.
We lack
by
ideals,
such
and we
leadership.
lack principles in international affairs.
And you don't have that, and those people who are basically involved one way or another in the Middle East, whether within the Middle East or leadership in countries that have involvement in the Middle East, I do not think that they are giving the impression of confidence to the wider public, and I think this is something that should be noted.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. If you ask me, actually, Palestine should even join the Commonwealth. I would love to see that. Afif Safia used to believe in that. He was ambassador to the UK for Palestine for a long time. But that aside, which may seem crazy, but I'm not so sure that it is so crazy. But that aside, the Palestinian, what we do need, don't we, is Palestinian recognition on the world stage as a state. And we're getting closer, but there the P5 are required to comply. So we need it as part of some deal in, who knows, but that would strengthen the Palestinian hand if we had recognition of Palestine. Even, wouldn't you say?
I totally agree. I have, after some thought, tried to sum up the situation as far as the Israelis and the Palestinians by way of an analytical perspective. And I've come to this. I'm not sure to what extent pretty much people would subscribe to it, but I've analyzed the conflict, the perceived conflict between the two and the existing conflict between the two sides. I've analyzed it as being one boiling down ultimately to the following. Security versus justice, and insecurity versus injustice. That means the insecurity that the Jews feel, the security that the Israelis desire versus the injustice that the Palestinians are suffering, and the justice that the Palestinians not only are looking for but very much deserve. And there is no doubt that, you know, doing the right thing in this particular case of international recognition, as you described it, William, would be the right thing, would be certainly the right thing in order to bring the Palestinians justice in this case, because it's very important to also, going back to the international community, it's very important to realize that arguably there hasn't been a greater failure among the international community in terms of allowing the suffering of people, or one people in this particular case, to go on for so long, in the sense especially the suffering of lack of justice. So would I like to see that happen at the international level? Certainly. I think it's not only something that should happen, it is something that is overdue.
Bless you. Well, actually, that's a good link into our next section. Thank you so much. We're going to talk in a moment, Maher, about your book. So, and exactly this idea is mentioned in this. Thank you for being our guest on ANN Television. It really has been a privilege, and thank you for those thoughts. So really interesting, not to say encouraging. Actually, I find an encouraging viewpoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you, William, for having me. It's an honor, and it's great to be with you.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Maher, this book, Maher Dabbah, promising Middle East, still a promising Middle East, and it's published by Content O. It's certainly an interesting book. It's remarkable book in many ways, and I found one or two points you make quite fascinating. I may need my glasses, but and presumably this oh, I left them. I know they're in my pocket. Presumably this some of these thoughts are fascinating, actually, and some of the allude to much what we've been saying. But the Israelis, the Palestinians, two players in the Middle East, and in the Middle East's biggest conflict, will never succeed in achieving peace between themselves until they both have learned how to adopt peace as a way of life. You're a believer in a change in attitude of mind on the part of both parties, really. This is what you're...
I'm not only a believer in that respect. When this statement... when I made it, again, it's after careful thought about the situation, which is it's simply meaningless to talk about peace between two sides without having the necessary ingredients for peace. And the necessary ingredients for peace always, as I've learned it in life, before you come to nations, if you look at it at an individual level, you can't achieve...
So sorry, Tom. Can you do from the top, please?
About the peace, right?
Yeah, please. I'm so sorry.
It's all right. We'll just try to remember what...
Yes, brilliant.
Yeah. So, with regard to this statement, William, I'm not only a believer in peace or a believer in this particular statement, but I'm also convinced about its accuracy, or you can even say the truth in practice. And that's simply because when you look at the situation, putting nations to one side, when you look at it at an individual level, at the level of a community, at the level of a society, as an individual, you can't really achieve peace with everybody around you until you've learned how to adopt peace as a way of life. If you do not lead a life that is based on peace, you're not going to have peace. And the same thing is true with regard to nations. And why did I make this particular statement, and why do I believe in its value as far as this book is concerned and the wider situation in the Middle East? It's simply because, again, to go back to something that we spoke about earlier, there is some work to be done on the part of both sides. How can I talk about peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians in this case when I look at, for example, the fact that children that go to Israeli schools, that go to Palestinian schools, do not benefit, do not enjoy, do not participate in a healthy education system? How can I talk about peace between two sides when I look at the individual leadership of the two sides not being really full subscribers of peace? So therefore, it's a statement, in my view, that carries the necessary ingredients, and that's exactly what I wanted to convey with this particular statement, that there are key ingredients, there are necessary ingredients for peace to be achieved between the two sides here, which is basically starting with each of these sides individually.
Now, bless you, I certainly do like some of these ideas. Peace is the design of the willing, and it is the act of the brave. And I love the phrase here. Peace requires compromise, and in addition to that, a deep belief that in compromise there is power and not weakness. Interesting read. It's an interesting book, Promising Middle East by Maher Dabbah, and published by Contento de Semric, an unusual publisher, but certainly available, I'm sure, well, I know it's available on Amazon and available to our listeners. An excellent book, and an honor to interview you. Thank you for being our guest on ANN Television. Thank you again, Maher.
Thank you very much indeed, William, for having me. A pleasure and an honor.
Thank you.